This video clip shows Luke, a 3-year-old boy with language.
Well, yes, good. And a lot of wine drinking, maybe, or at least some. For some, that's good. And I'm very happy you're back again. I don't know whether you all noticed that the son went to the hospital with an ambulance yesterday. She had her first allergic reaction ever. But it turned out okay, and I'm very happy you're back again. So a special welcome to you today. Okay, shall we start? All ready? Good? This is just to set the scene a little bit. When we start, you remember the model from yesterday, or the framework with engagement and engagement in, like in preschool or in home or in leisure or whatever, and engagement with, which is one level higher. And I'm really interested in how do these different levels link? What are the links between the levels? And in relation to that, if we're looking into interventions on individual and unit level in preschool, that we will talk about today, we can think about interventions very much focused on the child. It can be focused on child within the unit, and it can be focused on the unit itself. And Lena me and Madeleine and some other people have a study now that's submitted where we actually looked on provider support. And one of the problems is that professionals, sometimes external professionals, focus so much on the child that they come up and they plan an intervention very much engaged together with the parents, and then they bring that intervention into preschool without considering the preschool as a system. And it doesn't work in that system because it's pushed out because it's changed so much in the system. We have child in the unit, which of course has to be engage the preschool staff within that. And you have intervention focused on the unit that sometimes, at least when we look at it, actually is the unit. So they do things to individual children to manage the group, not really to help the child. So think in terms of that. And engaging with what could be actually in both ways here. We can do something in participation to actually increase body function. But the traditional way is to go from body to activity to participation. And we have 2 studies now, one on feeding and one on brain tumor. Maria and Anki is working with a brain damage and brain tumor, and Ellen, another doctoral student, is working on gastrostomy. And we're looking on the transition from medical care into school, preschool, or functioning in everyday life. And as you can see here, it's very much feeding, eating, mealtime. It's 3 different problems. But how are they linked in what people do in terms of intervention and engagement? And it's the same with the brain tumors. What is the focus when professionals engage in treatment? If you look into medical care, habilitation care, and out in school. Okay? So how are these links, both horizontally and vertical? Okay, now I'll give the word to Sam Odom, who has been working with issues regarding interventions within a natural environment for a long time, and especially in preschool.
These are uniquely Scandinavian. Thank you. So I'm a 2-trial learner. Let's see. So I will have to have some help finding my PowerPoint. This folder? Yep, that's it. Thank you. So I am going to take no longer than 30 minutes. Is that okay? And maybe shorter. So my charge today was to talk about individual or focused interventions on individual children. Mostly I'll be talking about children with disabilities and inclusion, but not exclusively. My name is Sam Odom. I'm a visiting professor at Stockholm University. I'm here for 1 month, and I'm being hosted by the Department of Special Education at Stockholm University, and I'm very pleased to be there and also to be invited down here. This is the first time I have been in this part of the country. As I was listening to presentations yesterday, I was thinking about how our field advances, how our knowledge expands. And one of my mentors one time told me that fields do not necessarily advance in a linear fashion, incremental. They often that progress is more like an upward spiral. So we could think about advancing our knowledge. I wanted to give a recognition to some of the early work that happened in the U.S. that for us serves as the basis of much of the engagement work that we've done. Runa yesterday talked about Barker and Wright and the ecological psychologists at the University of Kansas. I'm not sure why Kansas was always the epicenter of many of these things, but they very much set the stage for work that Todd Risley did in the 1970s. And this with one of the influential articles being published in 1972 about organization of then called daycare environments, and how one can arrange activities to promote participation of children and examining it in a very experimental way with small groups. Risley was just a remarkable man, and his Learning Environments Research Group produced multiple studies about preschool environments and factors in the environments that promote engagement. And it set I think it set the kind of the context for that upward kind of spiral. Robin McWilliams' work when he was at Western Carolina Center with Carl Dunst, Carol Trivet, and his engagement work sort of expanded from there. And I know I've seen you're citing his work several times and expanding on it, elaborating, advancing. So the work on engagement here has to be the sort of the top center in the world for research that's happening currently, and I'm just so impressed by what you're doing here in Jönköping and also internationally. So definitions. children potentially in need of individual interventions in early childhood settings. I'm going to talk about children with disabilities, children who may have developmental delays or intellectual disability or sensory impairments or motor impairments, children with cerebral palsy, or children with autism spectrum disorders, and a range of other delays. Broader concepts. If I go to a preschool and I'm talking with them about the child with disabilities, they will often tell me, well, he is not, and I'll use the term he because it's usually he is not the child having the most challenges in the program. That there are other children who also need support. Children, not necessarily children from minority groups because they're culturally different, but maybe income may play a factor. Maybe language may play a factor. So I'm talking broadly about children in need, but as I proceed through the interventions that have been developed for individual children in inclusive settings, mostly I'll refer to children with disabilities. About 10 years ago, I was having dinner with Martin Rausch from Cambridge University. We were talking about. He was saying that in the U.S. we tend to have what he calls psychological goals, and in the U.K. they focus more on sociological goals. So I said, what's the difference? What are those two? So as we continued in the conversation, he thought of psychological goals as being skill orientation or skill development, language acquisition, early literacy, social skills, learning or developmental outcomes from programs. And it's true, we do in the U.S. Tend to focus on that. But sociological goals, he was thinking about things that we've been talking about here at this conference: participation, membership, social acceptance, and he felt like we in the U.S. were sort of missing the point, and that was 10 years ago, and I think he was right. When I've heard you all talk about what it takes for an inclusive environment, I was reminded of some of the work that Peabody and Hiro Yoshikawa, Kim Boulders have done with an international group that has been attempting to identify what quality, or trying to define quality in early child care programs internationally. And they have a concept called equity. Everybody invents their own terms, but their concepts are almost identical to what you're talking about. That is, in early childhood programs, building a building is in low resource countries, for example, is not enough. One has to talk about what happens in that building when children come on a day-to-day basis. Just exactly the message that you're sending to. So when we talk about quality of inclusion, we do have some measures. I saw the QIEM yesterday that Mark Willery developed. Some of you all have been using that, and this afternoon I'll talk about how we've used it. Elena Sakaku developed the inclusive classroom profile, which is being used quite a lot in the U.S. I think she developed it when she was actually at Oxford, and then elaborated on it from there. She sees quality of inclusion as including these 12 dimensions, which I'm not going to go through, much to your relief, I'm sure. If you look, when one looks at the items, and I only had a rough draft, so pardon the watermark here. If one looks at the items, the participation clearly comes out as indicators of quality. Now, you may not be able to read this, but I can read it for you. So these items are the rating scale, the inclusive classroom profile is very much like the Eckers, except it focuses on inclusion. It's based on a 7-point rating scale, and 1 is inadequate. Children are not allowed to choose play activities, play topics, activities, or playmates, or explore toys. So programs like that get a 1 rating. Excellent, a 7 rating. Adults observe children's response to support and adjust their levels to the types and scaffolding as needed to facilitate sustained engagement. So there are several items and subdomains that do focus on engagement. We heard yesterday about the importance of inclusion. I'm not going to dwell on these, but because you're very familiar with these, the UN Convention of Rights, Article 23, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The first are the rights of children. The second are rights of children with disabilities. Again, very specific statements to ensure that inclusive education occurs for all children. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we heard yesterday about Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities. So very much an international sort of universal value about education. In the United States, there have been two groups that have come together. At the agency level, the U.S. Department of Education, our Department of Health and Human Services has made statements that children with disabilities need to be able to have access to and participate in inclusive settings. Two professional organizations, one for early childhood educators, another for children with disabilities, also created a joint statement. They defined inclusion, early childhood inclusion, as the right of every infant and young children and his or her family, regardless of ability, to participate in a broad range of activities and contexts as full members of families, communities, and societies. That will generate, they feel, again, an outcome, sociological outcome. It will generate a sense of belonging and membership, positive relationships, friendships, and development and learning. That joint statement has been very influential in our country and how early childhood education should be provided. The elements that we have talked about are very much embedded in that joint philosophy statement: access, participation, supports. So I wanted to take you back in history, if I could get the video to work. So in the U.S., one can track where this preschool inclusion, I think, movement or idea began. It was at Peabody College. Diane and William Bricker were investigators, and this was around 1970, 1971. If you look closely at this video, you may see Runa Simonson running around in the background. John,
4. What's after 4? 5.
Can you hear this?
That's right. Good. Come on, Christy. Come on.
Why is it that a particular child does what he does with the toys? You start to get very intrigued with how he is perceiving the world.
What is this? Can you tell me what this is? Isn't that a funny looking dog?
The basic reason behind bringing the non-delayed children in was for them
Diane
to serve
Bricker.
as developmental models for the delayed children. Behavior demonstrated by a young non-delayed toddler may be far more effective than the same behavior demonstrated by some big hulking teacher who is 4 times the size of a little toddler and who probably doesn't do it quite the way a toddler would do it anyway. And there's an incredible amount of learning going on between these two groups of youngsters. So far, according to all the data that we have, which at this point is somewhat limited, the non-delayed youngster's development is not hindered or slowed down in any way by being in a classroom with a delayed counterpart. The delayed child basically is no different from the non-delayed child, except that he simply acquires behaviors more slowly, and it takes more energy and it takes more structure. So every time we can make that learning more efficient for the delayed child, we've maximized his development and his adjustment eventually to the environment.
You want to sing about what do the wheels do? Good, Keith. That's right. Good, Amy. Let's sing about the wheels on the bus. Everybody get your wheels going. The wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round. The wheels on the bus go round and round, all through the town. Very good. Jeff sang with me. That was very nice. Okay, what else about the bus, Daniel? What would you like to sing about the bus? The mama's on. Oh, can you show Jeff how to do it? Oh. Come on, Jeff. That's right, look at Jody. Put your foot up here, Jeff. Attaboy, Jeff. That's right, come on, Jeff. Pull up, pull up. Oh, come on, pull up. There you go. Good. Okay, can you get up? Oh, there you go. Oh, okay. Now let's go up. Can you stand up now? Good. You on down. Okay.
I took some time to show that because, one, it's a little slice of history that for the U.S. was very influential in thinking about creating inclusive programs for children. This was a model demonstration program, a research program. So just as you all would never dream of having hairstyles like you saw in this, we probably wouldn't use some of the techniques that you saw here. But what I wanted to highlight is that some of the children, like Jeff in that last video, would attempt activities, would attempt engagement because there were other children serving as models. So if his teacher had been out with him alone with Jeff and was saying, we're going to learn how to do this gross motor thing to climb, it's quite possible that he would have just been turned off. He would have not attempted it or not have put as much effort into it. You saw how hard it was for him to pull up there. So that notion of environment and engagement is really set up by children in the classroom and activities in the classroom. This afternoon, you all were so great about presenting data yesterday, and I'm a little embarrassed I didn't bring very much data, at least none to show this morning, but some this afternoon. We have done some observations in preschool classrooms across a number of projects, and we find that this slide is misrepresentative. It's that children with disabilities tend to be engaged about 55% of the time using our measure. And I'll talk about that measure this afternoon. Children without disabilities a little bit more, but that's only 3% difference, and I couldn't get the range to adjust. So if you look at it across the whole range, there's not a whole lot of difference between the level of engagement that we have seen. What we have seen across projects is that engagement happens much more when children initiate the activity as compared to when adults initiate the activity. And so this shows the percentage of intervals in engagement when the teacher initiates and when the child initiates for children with disabilities and also for children without disabilities. And again, I'll talk a little more about this afternoon. So engagement is a central concept in inclusive programs. But we and we feel that engagement is an important outcome to examine. But for some children with disabilities, they may need more assistance. And I'm going to talk about 4 different approaches in the U.S. that related approaches designed to provide the kinds of support that may lead to increased engagement and may lead to increased skill acquisition. In the U.S., we're very enamored with the multi-tiered systems of support, which that concept is probably may or may not be new to you. It's very much built on the public health model of primary prevention. It begins with, it assumes that by providing a high quality inclusive or a high quality early childhood education program in an inclusive classroom, an inclusive program, that most of the children are going to be drawn in and actively engaged. The quality in the curriculum does that. The quality in the environment does that. But for some children, more support may be needed. And so these are, in the U.S., these are called Tier 2, and you may have heard that term used also. So there's a monitoring system where children are, it's determined they're not engaging or they're not participating as you want them to, so a little more support is provided. And then for children, after that level of support is provided, are not engaging, then there's another level of intensity that's provided. So that increasing level of support is embedded in the multi-tiered systems of support, which I have some issues with, but I'm not going to get into that. So one of the strategies in the U.S. that is uses that multi-tiered system of support is the pyramid model developed by the Center for Social and Emotional Foundations for Learning at Peabody College. Dale's colleagues there, Mary Lou Himmeter, and groups at other universities. But it follows from the idea, from that concept that we provide a very high, we have to have that foundation for children with disabilities and special needs, but there may be things that we need to do beyond that foundation to assist children to be engaged in the ways that we want them to be. And so they talk about, Mary Louise and group talk about targeted school emotional support interventions, which may be a curriculum that focuses on emotional learning, or identifying emotions, social interaction activities, and then maybe individual interventions for children. There's another curriculum that we have worked on and developed, the Building Blocks program. Susan Sandal is the first author of that, Eileen Swartz, and it follows the same idea that high quality inclusion or high quality programs are important, and that we can monitor children to see how engaged they are and make decisions about providing increased levels of support. For some children who have clearly identified disabilities and we know they're not going to be engaged without support, it's possible to intervene or to provide interventions that are up here. Embedded learning opportunities is another intervention approach in which learning opportunities happen during a regular routine or day. Activity-based intervention, embedded learning opportunities, incidental teaching, naturalistic developmental interventions are different terms for what essentially is very, very much a similar activity. So beginning with the identification of learning goals, analyzing, looking in the environment where there's opportunities for participation, for learning activities to happen, and then providing support. So the people in the U.S. that are doing the best, I think the most solid work on this are Pat Snyder and Mary McLean at the University of Florida, and they have some very good data showing that it actually occurs. So these are some examples of embedded learning opportunities. So providing a suggestion to a child during an activity that they're engaged in.
We have broccoli for lunch. Do you like broccoli? Yeah. What color is broccoli? Green. Let's see. Is the water warm? Yeah. And is this warm or cold? Cold. Let's see what happens.
Would like to
When I pour some
encourage doing an activity
water
like this.
on the cold ice. What color is the water turning? I might need some. Yeah, water's only.
Visual model during a part-time playtime activity.
And another letter in your name, E. And what's the birthday? Good job. Okay, so June. So what is your birthday? June the 1st. June the 1st. Can you write a 1? Oh, there's your birthday. Okay, look at that. Look at that.
Enough time and support
Yeah, you're
is
starting
needed
at the
to
top.
engage in the activity.
Very nice.
Violate that rule because of time. But the idea that some children take longer to be involved in an activity is an important one, and that may be an important thing for the peers in the classroom to know, because if they're socially engaging the child, then they need to know that the child may not respond back as quickly. Universal design for learning is another approach that I won't be able to have time to talk about very much, but the Eva Horn and group developed a curriculum called the Inclusive Preschool Curriculum that draws from the Universal Design for Learning concepts in building programs that they are very explicit about programs for disabilities, but more broadly about children who have other challenges in the classroom. So Universal Design for Learning is based on the concept that there may be different ways of engaging in the environment or providing responses to the environment. So in a storybook activity, one can talk about the theme, one can point to pictures to respond. The last approach that I'm going to mention is we've called peer-mediated instruction or peer buddies, that in which peers are taught or are encouraged to socially engage their children, their classmates with disabilities in ways that may lead to engagement. So I'm going to show a brief video here that's to sort of conclude my talk. And I'll set it up where you'll see a little boy with disabilities at a water play table out in North Carolina. It gets really hot in the summertime. So the kids go out and play in the water to cool off. But those are valuable learning times. So for this little boy, it's important that he engage in different activities because he may be always going to this one water table, and that's all he does. He stands here the whole time. So let's see if I can get this to play.
This video clip shows Luke, a 3-year-old boy with language delays at school. His teacher is prompting a classmate to introduce Luke to a new water play activity.
Can you say, here, Luke, here's the ducky. Look, Luke. Look, Luke. Ava's giving you the ducky, Luke. Look. Say thank you. He said thank you, Ava. Luke. I'm trying to Luke. Ava, come get Luke to the water. Can you take Luke to the water?
Don't drink it, Day-Day.
Tell Luke, say, come on, Luke.
No drinking.
Come on, Luke. Go with Ava. walking through the water, Ava, so we can get wet. Walking through. Walking through. Go ahead. Watch out. You like it, Lou? Want to do it again? Ava, do it again. Take it back through. Edward, watch out. Stand back some, Edward. Come on, stand back.
So he doesn't have to be in, he doesn't have to stand under the sprinkler the whole time, but making sure that he gets out around other activities, he participates in other activities is really an important part of this inclusive preschool. The teacher in our peer-mediated interventions, the teacher is at an early stage of showing the peers what they can do to help Luke be engaged. So closing points, inclusion of young children with disabilities have many goals. The key features of successful inclusion that I just talked about and that our field has adopted is membership, meaningful participation, positive social relationships with peers. And we will be talking some more about that in one of the sessions this afternoon. So thank you very much.
To be a rock star again. This is really fun. I need a band. Are you going to start me up? All right, so now for something completely different. That's how I feel every time I come here. Every time I start, I'm doing something different. Well, so I'm going to, as Mott said, I'm going to be focusing on the unit level. And if you think about it from Sam's, ML's, teapot and the pyramid, I'm really trying to focus on the bottom tier so that we think about how to make better environments. There's a lot of talk about quality, which is very easy term to use, completely undefined. And so everybody nods and says, absolutely, I'm committed to quality. Well, okay, what does that mean anyway? So I'm gonna try out an idea I had. This is one of my ahas, and if all of you look completely puzzled, then I won't pursue it. This is my new thing called the iceberg theory of early childhood competencies. So this is right, okay. So I think that a lot of the focus that is increasingly in pre-Ks in the U.S. and, as Ava was saying yesterday, also increasingly in some countries in the European Union, not the Nordic countries, but Portugal and some other countries, we have this real idea that what should be attained by the end of the early childhood period, so age 5, are these concrete skills. You know your letters, you know your numbers, you know your sounds, you know your colors, and then you go in and you're ready for school, right? But I'm going to argue that there's actually a whole set, let me go back for this. So when we measured these sorts of things in children before, I want to argue with you that they were actually indicative of other skills. They were the tip of the iceberg, with the implication that there was a deep iceberg underneath that led to those skills being developed. And what was that? Well, the concrete skills and letters and sound are just a manifestation of these deeper underlying skills that include having a broad vocabulary, having a real interest in language. Think about your own children, those of you who are parents, being curious, being persistent, being attentive, incidental learning. So not everything is directly taught. Children learned, unfortunately, sometimes things we wish they wouldn't, from incidental connections or exposure to various things in the environment. Children are like sponges, so they're picking up all the stuff that's out there. They have a drive to learn. sometimes that drive to learn can be impeded, possibly by a physical limitation, but there's still a drive to learn and gather new materials. Predictability, and if you think about participation, it's another word for it might be connectedness. So I'm connected to adults, I'm connected to other peers. So those are the underlying skills that we don't have any good ways to measure. So we've developed these ways of measuring these more concrete skills with an implicit assumption that they are a reflection of these broader, deeper skills. But I want to argue that actually in a lot of the pre-K programs, these top skills, this top of the iceberg, has gotten disconnected from the iceberg. So that when you just teach these concrete skills, it does not mean that you're actually affecting those deeper skills. And so when you have a focus of a pre-K program or programs that are operating so that you have teaching approaches that include a lot of whole group didactic instruction, a lot of teacher-directed learning, so teachers decide what it is you're going to learn and how it is you're going to learn it. All of the work we've done on trying to enhance children's language skills in pre-K environments. What happens is teachers, they have these prescriptive methods of teaching vocabulary, and sure enough, children learn the 26 words or 40 words that were actually taught as part of the book, and it doesn't generalize to language learning at all. And it doesn't generalize to other things, because that's really not how you learn language. You learn language because you're really interested in language, and because something you're interested in, somebody puts a word to it, and you realize that there are lots of words around to learn, and so you become really interested in thinking about what words are connected to what on the basis of your own child's own interest. There's a lot of rigid control that we're seeing. So if your goal is we're going to get these concrete skills, then you have approaches that wind up increasing those skills, but perhaps not affect those. But those skills, I'm going to argue, are fragile. Drew Bailey, who's just up and coming rock star in the U.S., terrific person. Very interesting person. And he and Greg Duncan are calling these fragile skills. So basically, these are skills that children are going to learn anyway. You don't need a pre-K program necessarily to teach them, because most children are going to learn them anyway. From exposure to formal education. They're going to learn letters, sounds, numbers, and school readiness, right? However, these underlying skills are probably facilitated by very different kinds of experiences. Extended conversations, predictable routines in your environment, positive responses, the freedom to make choices and follow through on those choices, enrichment around where there are interesting things to get involved in, rewards for being creative, a time to focus, book reading, adult scaffolding, support for risk-taking. Those kinds of behaviors are probably the ones that are linked to the development of these underlying skills and are the most difficult to put into a classroom environment. So people by default go into that very inappropriate teaching. But those are the skills I want to argue. Those are the ones that support learning throughout school. So being ready with these concrete skills is not what's going to sustain you to learn new things when you get to second grade or third grade or fourth grade. It's these underlying skills that carry you forward and allow you to learn new things. So, but the important issue is how to build those underlying skills for children. For me, I'm interested in children in less economically secure families. I'm also interested in children with disabilities, but my focus recently has really been on this targeted intervention program we have for children from poor families, putting 20 low language children together with 2 adults in a classroom. Whoever thought that was a good idea? Anyway, once our data came out from the Tennessee pre-K study and the negative effects that we were seeing in second and third grade, I decided that I shouldn't just retire. I should try to do something else. So, and try to make a difference in what was going on. So I formed this partnership with Metro Nashville Public Schools. They formed 3 model pre-K hubs. It's like, pardon me, I don't want to insult anybody, I always do, but it's like educators say when they just announce something, it's going to be a model. That's like it already is. So just announcing it doesn't make it so. Just because you label it a model doesn't make it a model. So we formed this partnership, and we were going to create this data-driven change process where we were going to collect a lot of information about the classrooms and gave it back in real time. We were going to identify markers that led to a model that could be, according to Metro Nashville Schools, that could be disseminated. So we did child assessments and classroom observations. You who are researchers must know that when you do these extensive classroom observations, we got them back, the data, in 2 weeks. Exactly. It nearly killed us. So we used a couple of different ways. We used a time use record thing called the narrative record, which actually is looking at the classroom from the top down. So how is time being spent? How is time allocated to different pedagogical strategies and to different content? We use something, so for instance, you can, the narrative record is very appealing because you can capture the whole classroom. We're there from 7:30 in the morning till the classroom ends. It's very taxing. So let's say you're writing. It's a narrative because you're writing down notes, and those notes then enable you to make a judgment about that instructional episode. So in this case, for instance, I'm highlighting for you over 55 minutes of observation these areas that were transition times. Then we have areas that were whole group. And then we can look at areas where math was being taught. These are kind of fantasy numbers because math's never taught that much. So let's see how time is being spent in these classrooms. What's interesting about this is they said we have a model. Now I want to show you. Remember now, these are the concrete skills we're talking about. So they said we have a model. What's interesting is both the mean, so this is across 26 classrooms, 61 minutes were spent on average in whole group instruction. 67 minutes were spent on average in transitions, which I talked about yesterday with the 2 most commonly seen uses of time. But look at the range. So what vision is being understood by the 26 teachers if there's a range from 18 minutes in whole group to 98 minutes in whole group? If there's a range in center time, which is free play in Sweden, from 27 minutes in one classroom to 206 minutes in another classroom, it does not imply that people have an understood and shared vision for what's to be done in these classrooms. Similarly, when you look at what the focus was, you only had 2 classrooms that did any intentional teaching in math at all. And the range was from 0 minutes to 24 minutes. You only had 24 classrooms that did any music and movement, but it was only for 14 minutes. Except you have a range of 0 to 50 minutes. So you have remarkable differences going on in classrooms that are supposed to be serving the same sorts of children and were pulled together to be models of pre-K programs. So we use something called the TOP. And I'm just going to quickly give you this gives you sort of what the teacher was doing across the day. And what you see, let me just speak up here, in the blue is 35% time in instruction, 26% of her time managing, getting out materials, moving children from place to place. Administration, often in Tennessee, that means checking to see there's no tornadoes coming. Monitoring, 11% personal care. But here's the thing. So 9% of the time, teachers were behavior disapproving and 4% behavior approving. So what you do get a sense of when you look at this is that there is an implicit theory of change for how children learn, which is it's more by the stick than the carrot. So it's more by controlling their behavior than it is enhancing or enticing their behavior. Teacher verbal behavior. Teachers talked on average 69% of the time. Children were awash in teacher talk. This is just a teacher. This is not even the assistant. Teachers listened 15% of the time. And the thing about this is the listening to particularly was ranged from 5%, so there was one teacher who only listened to children 5% of the time, to 32%. So you have quite different behaviors going on. Well, here's the advantage of that for me as a researcher. So if you've got variability among classrooms in the gains children made, which we did, and you have variability among classrooms in the time spent, which we did, and the interactions, which we did, you can look at the relationship between them. Right? As soon as everybody's doing the same thing and you reduce the variability, which we were talking about with the Portuguese yesterday, the variability in child involvement that they rated in the classrooms was very small. Therefore, it becomes really hard to predict anything when you don't have any variability in your predictor. We've got variability in our predictor and we've got variability in our outcomes. But we only had 26 classrooms. So we decided that this is a new role for me as a researcher because I'm used to 3,000 children. So we decided that what we would do is not pay attention to p-values, but we would pay attention to effect sizes. So an effect size is a proportion of the standard deviation that's different from pre to post. So we looked for things that had effect sizes of 0.2 or better. And we just clustered everything together that looked like it was related to, it first had to be related to more than one outcome. So we weren't just looking for what predicts math. We were looking for what makes a more facilitative environment for children in general. So we were looking for things that predict more than one outcome and have effect sizes of 0.2. And we came up with 8. Which we shared with the coaches and directors in July of 2015, and which now, I didn't make this up, they called it the Magic 8. And they put a little 8-ball, and they made a little diagram, and they put it up in their rooms, and now suddenly, actually, I'm not suggesting you do, but if you wanted to Google the Magic 8, you're going to see this has been picked up a lot. Now, nationally, it's gotten a lot of attention because we have a child development article about this, and people are quite intrigued with the term the Magic 8. So, all right, what are they? What did we find that was related to children's outcomes in a positive way? Reducing the amount of transitions, so reducing the amount of downtime. Increasing the quality of instruction. For those of you who've heard me talk before, I'm just going to be like a broken record. So what do we mean by quality of instruction? We mean having interactions with children that are not asking known answer questions only. And those were wonderful videotapes that Sam showed, but those questions were all known answer questions. So it's really hard for teachers to engage with children. It's impossible in a whole group, but it's really hard for teachers to engage with children and ask them to start thinking about things, to engage with the children in having a conversation where the teacher doesn't actually know what the child's going to say and has to build on that contribution from the child. We don't see it very often. I think in free play here you've seen it 4 times. Yeah, out of 126 instances of instruction. So creating a more positive emotional climate, which means more behavior, switching that ratio so there's more behavior approving than there is disapproving, and creating an emotional climate where the teacher actually smiles during the day. You'd be amazed how serious the teaching business is, and therefore how one should not be anything other than neutral in your classroom. helping teachers learn to actually listen to children, and listening to children is going to improve your quality of instruction. You can't carry on and think about what a child's saying if you don't actually ever listen to what they're contributing. Creating sequential activities. What's a sequential activity? It means one where you have to plan what you're doing, one that has a sequence of steps to it. These are more demanding activities, but they're also ones that engage children for longer periods of time because they involve steps. Fostering associative interactions with children. I was really stunned that all these things came out. So 40 years of work, good. Fostering higher levels of involvement by children, and interestingly, creating more math opportunities. So the amount of time children were engaged in math, they weren't intentionally taught math very much, but math activities tended to be in the centers. The more time children engaged with math, the more math was available for them to actually get engaged in, the more gains we saw in a variety of things. Okay, so good, we told them this. All right, so this has been a humbling experience. I'm not even going to go there. So that's good. I'm going to finish 10. Right. So this has been I could tell you lots of anecdotes. This has been a really humbling experience because we collected a lot of information. We summarized it. We got it cleaned up and summarized in 2 weeks. We came in with basically printouts of charts and graphs and data to share. And people went like, they had no idea what to do with the information. My hubris was that we would give them this information, they would look at it, and then they would say, oh, this is what we should do. Well, that didn't happen at all. So by actually narrowing down what we were looking at and giving them feedback on these 8 things in a very focused way, we made it more possible for them to engage with us and think about what it is they were trying to improve. So over the next year, here's what happened. They did reduce their transitions. They reduced their transitions by a lot. They did actually decrease the amount of behavior disapproving they were doing. They did do a little more listening to children. Now, I hate to tell you this, but by the spring, they had backslid. So, stop. So that the transitions kept being down, which was good, but actually the behavior disapproving started creeping back up, and the listening started creeping back down. So I think changing adult behavior is a whole lot harder than changing children's behavior. So it meant that in the second year, we had almost as much, and interestingly enough, we shared all this with coaches. There was teacher turnover. One would have thought that the new teachers coming in would not look like the teachers had looked the year before, because now the coaches would have known what to focus their coaching on. But instead, that was wrong. The new teachers looked exactly like the teachers had the first year. And so we had as much variation in teacher practices the second year as we did the first year, and we got the same relationships to gain. So in some ways that was heartening. We replicated the same relationships. In some ways it was very discouraging because it meant that the variation was still there in practice. So our next steps, we're in year 4 of this partnership. I'm going to talk a lot about that this afternoon, about what our attempts to work with the coaches and attempts to try to have them provide us more information that leads to their owning the changes we're trying to make rather than our prescribing the changes we're trying to make. Getting them not just attending but participating. So that's our goal, is to try to create some ownership. And we are really busily trying to get funding for something we're calling, this is my wonderful young colleague called this the Classroom Quality Real-Time Evidence-Based Feedback, CQ-REF. She actually likes to have a picture of a ref when she shows this. I sort of avoid that. But you should know that apps are now obsolete. If you didn't know that, you heard it from me here first. So what you can do is you can have a mobile web-based portal, which means that you can continually change what's behind the scenes. So every time you log into it, it's been updated. You don't have to update yourself. You're logging into a web that's being updated. And we're trying to create a system that will allow us to collect classroom observation data on an iPad with coaches doing the collecting of the information, and that then we will give them feedback that interprets their data and compares it to what we've seen for other teachers, other classrooms. The coach may be part of her workload, and previous observations with that specific classroom. But in addition, what will be on this portal is information about practices that are directly related to what the coach has now observed in the classroom. So not every teacher has the same issue. So if I'm observing a classroom that really has problems with transition, there will be access to information that will help you focus on transitions. But if this teacher is fine on transition but has a problem with behavior disapproval, then you can go and look for information that helps you relate to that. If I live long enough, our long-term goal is that we actually create something that gives principals a better way to look at classrooms and judge what's appropriate. Because these classrooms that are in public schools are being judged by their principals on measures that are really built for second graders and fourth grade teachers, and are highly inappropriate for 4-year-olds. So if you want to know more information about, see that? Look at that, I finished at 10. So if you want to know more information about the Magic 8, we have this website where you can actually learn more about the Magic 8, and also there are resources there that we've already started to developing that address each of these 8 areas and that can provide some help on thinking about how to make changes in the classroom. So I thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Okay. Morning. Hello? Can you hear me?
Say again.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Morning. I want to share with you the experience of Taiwan. Yeah, based on the international trend, we define childhood participation as being a part of everyday life situation that include regular activities and the routines of any settings in which children spend time. Children's involvement in the activities and the routines may need to be adapted to ensure they are able to be an integral member of the activity or routines. And also based on sustainable development goal from UN, we want to ensure inclusive and quality of education for all and promote lifelong learning. And for the international rehabilitation program, we also know that taking advantage of the preschool and the daycare institutes as a connection between families and the community to development and an integrated, sustained, and inclusive and a lifelong community rehabilitation program for children. This is our rationale for conducting a Taiwanese style of early intervention in preschool. This is the location of Taiwan. You can see Taiwan is a very small island, and we have 22 cities in Taiwan. But the popularity is larger than Sweden. We have 23 millions of people, and the children under 6 years of age is about 1 million. The children with developmental delay is less than 2%, but the children at risk for developmental delay are unknown in Taiwan. Children with disability under 6 years is less than 1%. In Taiwan, early intervention covers 0 to 6 years of age. This is the very dangerous situation in Taiwan because we have educator child ratio of 1 to 15 in Taiwan in average preschools. But for the developmental center, it's better. We have the ratio of 1 to 3 to 5 children. And also in the classroom, we have other assistants, also have itinerary teachers, professionals, and parents or some consultants for both kinds of settings. So in Taiwan, we have a more complex situation. Many children with special needs now receive both clinical rehabilitation and school-based therapies at the same time. And they have a lot of so-called segregated intervention in Taiwan. So we want to have an integrated program for children in preschool. So the current pilot study, we try to consolidate the conceptual framework of participation-based therapy and the routine-based model into a practical model. We name it the routine-based engagement classroom models, which is designed to be applicable and practical to preschool and the daycare settings in Taiwan. Routine-based model is widely disseminated in the world. In Asia, Taiwan and Singapore are the two countries who conduct this kind of model. This kind of model follow very concrete strategies of procedures from eco map and routine-based interview, and we with parent together participation-based goals for family or children, and we provide the primary service providers to get into the classroom to observe the children and the teachers. Activities, and we also provide family some consultations, and we also provide collaborative consultation to childcare in classroom. This is the strategies, and I agree with Dr. Ferran that when we went into the classroom, we find the hardest one is to deal with the adults, not the child. So we began to search a lot of strategy how to make a relationship with our teachers. So we use the PSP primary service providers to teach various strategy of helping teachers. So such as support and observation and coaching practice or some feedback. So the purpose of this study is to investigate the professional development of this model, and also to investigate the intervention outcome and the process of children and the family in this model. But today we are focused on the second one. The first one, maybe we left to the afternoon discussion. So the participants include the PSP and the classroom educators and the children aged 2 to 6 years who attend preschool or developmental center, and also the family from very diverse backgrounds. So this is our original study design. This is a randomized control trial. The experimental group will attend the routine-based model, but the control group just follow their usual care. The first half of the year, we have do a lot of professional training and building relationship with the educators in order that we can get into the classroom. Yeah, and the other 6 months, we began to have a baseline data collection, and we follow 4 semesters to observe the child engagement and the teacher's engagement, and we finally have a follow-up stage. But now we only proceed to these 2 stages. Yeah, so we have the magic 1 year. Yeah. Okay, let's have a bigger picture of these 2 stages. The first one is focus on professional training, and the second stage is focus on observing in the classroom and do some PSP on-site training. So we use some outcome measure to have pre and post differences. The first outcome measure, we use Chinese version of assessment of preschool children's participation. These measures give us 4 domains of activity participation, but it focuses on being layer of participation because it measures the diversity and the intensity of the daily life activity that children participate. And the second one is the goal attainment scales. I think you may very familiar with this outcome measure. And for the process observation, we use 3 key observers and 3 measures. The measures we include one of the measure from Dr. McWilliam, the scale of teachers' assessment of routines engagement. These measures measure the general engagement, and the time the child spends on interact with children, adults, and the materials. So we can have this to look at the child engagement and spend time on this activity. And the second one is the Vanderbilt ecological congruence of teaching opportunity in routine classroom version. This measures have three domains: engagement, independency, and peer interaction. And for each domain, we can have the information from the learning opportunity provided by environment or from the teachers for the children. And also we have the child's engagement performance in this domain. So we can averaging this score to have a general pictures of the child participation or engagement. And the third one is for teacher, is teaching style rating scale. This scale rating two types of teachers' performance. The part one is teaching strategies, and the part two is teachers' effects during classroom running all the time. Yeah, this is an example of the real classroom. You can see in this classroom, we follow a radio media classroom structure, and we have some very natural material from outside, and have some very familiar for children that in their daily life. And we have the key educators and the other secondary educators. Two of these educators follow the zone defense schedule. And the main educators will follow the child's lead to collaborate with child to conduct the activity. But the other educator should take care of the children who are not engaged in this activity or other things such as administration or some logistics need to handle at this time. And this one is the PSP for this classroom. She used to observe in the classroom and provide help for the two educators if needed. So we use some simple statistics to collect the data. We use the average score for each day of the observation between pre and post test. And we also use pair t-test to compare pre and post differences. Finally, a total of 45 families and their children from 9 preschool or daycare centers was successfully enrolled, and 34 families of them were followed for pre and post test. This is all potential developmental center who conduct the routine-based model, but some of them signed the consent, informed consent to be enrolled in this study. And these are the preschools in Taiwan who follow our study design. You can see this is Dr. Robin McWilliam. He came to Taiwan 2 years ago to help us to build the model. And you also can see that you are familiar with his maths and Java. Went to one of our very rural area of preschool and have a lot of variable suggestions for us. Yeah. So we have many international friends. The demographic data for children and the family, we can see most of them are boys. And in Taiwan, our birth rate is very low. And also the birth order of these children are mostly the first one child. And the mother's education almost beyond the senior high school. And this is the classroom, the child's classroom. Our classroom usually divided by ages, but some classrooms they are mixed age children inside. The diagnosis is mostly developmental delay. And for preschool educators, none of the preschool educators are male or are female. Around the various countries, cities in Taiwan, and they teach also diverse age of level for the children. For the outcome measure for pre-post comparison, we also collect some data from traditional developmental domain. We can see from the being layer concept, there are no difference between pre and post tests. But for the developmental domain, they have some significant improvements in social and self-help domain after the PSP go into the classroom to do some observation and help. For the process, we can see we got a total of 370 observations for stairs and 445 observations from vectors. The routines of the circle time, snack time, and the center time were represented in each visiting day of observation. Most of the time they spend on the so-called whole group circle time. And a lot of time are spent on transition and center time. This is one example of the observation in classroom. This is a 4-year girl with global developmental delay and from a very disadvantaged family. You can see it's the child's home. Very poor family. And this is one of the classroom the child engaged. You can see the child inside. This is the target child. She actually is not in the classroom. So she engaged in different activity rather than the teacher lead activity. So when we use the vector to observe the congruency of the classroom, we can see the blue line is the environment that provide for children to have more learning opportunity. The higher the score represent more opportunity in the classroom. And the red line present the opportunity given by the teacher or educator. And the green line is the child engagement. So we can see before PSP enter into the school, this fluctuates a lot, and the child usually just going very down. Even the environment are very full of opportunity. But after PSP came into the classroom, the children try to catch up their performance and parallel with the opportunity the teacher provide. This is for independence. Again, we can see child performance line between these two lines. One is environment and one is teachers providing learning opportunity. We are happy to see this pattern because our teacher-to-child ratio is so high. If the teacher in very high school, they will quickly quit the job because too exhausted. So this pattern is better for us because teachers don't do too much for a single child, but they have the strategy to modify their environment to a higher, providing higher opportunity for the children. And the children can fit a bit between these two lines. It is a very good transaction between teacher and the child after PSP go into the classroom. This is for peer interaction. We can see the same pattern as the previous two domains. The child began to lie between the two blue and the red line. Yeah. For the unit level, we try to observe the average score for the children and the one educators of the two educators. And these two educators actually supported by a PSP. And the PSP, it is not alone. Behind the PSP, we have some professionals and some assistants and family to support them to go into the classroom to support the educators. So we can see it is the a long time of observation for the stair. We just see the general picture. We can see the level of child performance and the teacher's teaching strategy and the teacher's effects, and also factor for the child ability. We can see if the score of children are higher and the teacher's performance will be higher. And this one, these teachers, some a little lower, and the children's score get lower, and this also get lower. This is a very different pattern. We saw this teacher have very fluctuating teaching strategy and emotion. So the child began to vary it with the teacher. Yeah. So we also collect some qualitative data to explain the phenomenon we have observed in the classroom. All the preschool educators we met, and they all have a lot of experience of teaching child. So most of the time they are so exhausted and tired, but not don't know how to teach the child. So this is our explanation for the observation. And the preschool educators actually can incorporate participation-based goal into classroom routines. You can see the environment score get higher after we observe. So, but the lack of professional skills of integrating the knowledge of spatial education into the classroom. The preschool educators adapt their teaching strategy and the environment adjustment based on their understanding of young children's participation through classroom observation. So the best routines of preschool educators to address the goal were free time, transition time, and meal time. This is based on the teacher's reflection during the classroom. And the PSP played the role as a facilitator, a listener, and observers, and a demonstrator, and also coordinator for the preschool educators. For the children, we can see the distinct pattern of interaction show across the child and the educator pairs. For all kinds of classroom, the frequency of social interaction with peers was generally less frequent than interaction with adults and the materials. Yeah. So conclude that this is the baseline study. So the baseline result indicates a transaction between child and educators in the unit level in the classroom. This program would form an evidence-based and textual appropriate practical model in Taiwan. Yeah, we are supported by a funding of Taiwanese Ministry of Science and Technology. And also we have Dr. Su here to collaborate to conduct the study in the following semesters. And we also very thank our international collaboration and the international friends to give us many strategies to conduct these studies. Yeah, this is a dream of Taiwan. This non-profit preschool is established this year. We just based on the evidence base and to do a pre-opening professional training for the teachers. So all the teachers know the routine-based model and know the PSP and already have a lot of resources to support this running of these preschools. So we are happy to do this. Yeah, for further study, we would like to enroll children and family teachers in preschool or institute will be followed for the next semesters. And we also want to collect more qualitative data if needed to explain the phenomenon we saw on the quantitative observation. So we are encouraged by the children and their caregivers in families and preschool. And thank you for your patience. Thank you for your engagement. Yeah, repeat.
Thank you, Iwan. Eric, we heard you before.
Good morning. Hey. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah, it's okay. So most of the talks have been focused on preschoolers and children with disabilities of some type. I'll be talking about infants that are typically developing. So why am I here? I think it's to be able to, I'm going to be talking about a study that's ongoing right now, and it's a design that we're using to use a novel kind of intervention. And I think that maybe you can take something from it, I hope. So we'll talk a bit about what it is. So this study is funded by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. It's a pilot study right now, so we're in the process of collecting data. So I'm going to spend more time today talking about the background for why we've designed the study that we have, and the way that we're actually doing our data collection to help you think through some of those things. So I want to show you what we hope happens during infancy into adulthood, is that babies learn how to eat well, and they're exposed to lots of different foods, and they're able to control their own appetites, and they grow and they develop optimally into adults that are healthy and following nice variation in diet, and they're not too heavy, they're not too thin. They're like Goldilocks, I guess, right? It's just right, you know. But what we see happening in the U.S., and we've certainly seen probably happening in perhaps in some of your countries as well, is that we're seeing an increasing prevalence of obesity in early childhood. So this is our most recent national data. So it's a bit old data, but it's the most recent national data that we have in the United States. So when we take a look at obesity rates, we see differences across different ethnicities as well. So our highest risk groups are our non-Hispanic Black and our Hispanic. What you'll see is that from birth to 2 years, we see differences. When we get to 2 to 5 years of age in the darker color, it's really, really coming up there. So my background is nursing, and primarily as a nurse practitioner. And so I'm very interested in prevention of problems rather than when they've begun. And so that's what my focus is on in terms of the research that I do, is how do we help children to have optimal development and prevent children who might otherwise not be obese from becoming obese. So that's what we focus on today. So it's quite common in the US, and maybe it is in other places too, for people to think that a fat baby is a healthy baby. And so we don't, and people say, don't worry about it, they're going to outgrow this weight. For many of you that were with me yesterday afternoon, some of this will be review, but we'll get into some new content, I promise. But for a significant number of children, we see something that's happening more like this. So they go on to become overweight toddlers, and then into adolescence, we're seeing obesity, and tracking into adulthood, and all of the associated problems that go along with this, with diabetes and heart disease, depression, so psychological and physical ailments that go along with this condition. The other thing that we see is that this relationship seems to get stronger the earlier it's in place. So this was an older study, but what I want to point out in particular is this second aspect here, that when they looked at these children, when they're in the first year of life, if they're obese as a 1-year-old, then they're 4 times more likely to be obese as a 2-year-old than a non-obese 1-year-old becoming obese. But if by 3 years of age, where is my cursor? There we go. 62.5% of overweight children at 3 are still overweight at 4, versus only 4.1% of a non-overweight 3-year-olds become obese in the next year, 15 times more likely if a 3-year-old to be obese as a 4-year-old. So this seems to get stronger as you go along. The other thing we see is, looking back with this study by Harrington and colleagues, is they took a look at children that were 11, 12, 13 years of age to say, what was the tipping point? These were children that were obese already and in treatment programs. When did they become obese? And when they looked back at the medical records, they saw that the average was at 22 months of age. 25% were already obese by 5 months. And if you took into account if they were overweight or obese before, it's actually 15 months, 25% at 3 months or more. So there's something happening for many, many children in the early period of life here. And that's my focus in terms of thinking, how can we improve what's happening there for them? And why? The infants are obviously very dependent initially. And so caregivers have a lot of control over what's happening with feeding for babies. They decide on the type of food, whether they will get breast milk, formula, some type of complementary foods. They decide how frequent the babies are going to be fed, how long they will be fed, how much they will be fed. There's variation in these things. And the method in which they'll be fed. Again, breast, bottle, spoon, cup. My son a long time ago. Yeah. So when we look at intervention research, there has been growing numbers of studies that are starting to say, what types of interventions can we do in early childhood? And so they've embraced a number of different strategies, including sleep. So there's increasing evidence for looking at the relationship between sleep and obesity. So they've been saying, well, let's see what we can do in terms of improving sleep outcomes for infants. When we think about obesity too, we think about it's an imbalance in this equation of the amount of energy that's being taken in versus the amount of energy that's being expended. So let's see if we can increase physical activity for our babies, get them to burn more calories, right? This is another approach you could take. Trying to improve breastfeeding outcomes, increases in food varieties, so that there's really nice evidence that the more flavor exposures that infants experience, even in utero, that they will have more varied diets. And so they think too that this is one of the things that's very supportive about breastfeeding, is that the flavors that the mom's food that she's eating come through in the breast milk. And versus in formula, it's always the same. Can you imagine eating the same food every day? Every meal? Maybe not so great. Yeah. We also look at the interventions have looked at the timing of when they're introducing solid foods. So for a lot of infants, and particularly in low income or in some of the different ethnic groups, at least in the United States, there's early introduction of solid foods. So they'll actually be feeding table foods sometimes when the babies are only a few weeks old, or the recommendations are to wait at least 6 months. It's quite common for people to take rice cereal and put it in the bottles so that the babies are drinking formula with the rice cereal there as well, with the idea that this is going to make them feel more full and help them sleep better, which is going to give mom and dad a break so they can sleep. And then we've also looked at how we can increase responsiveness of caregivers to the infant's cues of hunger and satiety. So what have we found in terms of these different researches? Improvements in sleep, less TV exposure, that's good, decreased sweet or juice intakes, delayed introduction of solids, these are all good things, increasing breastfeeding duration or rates, and increased parental responsiveness, at least self-reported, not observed. This is where I come in, because I'm not an observational methodologist, and we've seen differences between what parents say that they do and what they actually do. So, lots of nice outcomes here, right? Most of these studies have failed to show any significant impact on body mass index or weight for length. 2 found a decrease in this series of studies. A couple found an increase, actually, from the interventions in weight or length. From a safety standpoint, on the good end of things, is that none of the intervention studies demonstrated a concerning weight loss or delay. So there's always a concern if you're trying to teach someone about how to help their baby not be overweight, that they may take it to the extreme and actually start restricting, and then the baby's going to fall off in terms of their growth curves. So we haven't seen that, so that's a good thing. The issue with most of these studies failing to show significant impact, we're not sure exactly why, but I can say that the time frame for follow-up is usually around 6 months of age, and so or 6 months after the intervention. So it may be that it's too soon to actually be seeing the changes, and that we need to follow longer. So longer longitudinal studies will be helpful in that regard. This is a recent review of literature as well for intervention research. And it's a busy slide, but what I want to point out to you is 2 things here. The most effective interventions, when we look between interventions happening in the clinical setting, the home, in the community, or biological, and the biological interventions are doing things like changing the types of formulas that are giving, or adding different macronutrients or micronutrients to formulas to see if that can make a change. The most effective interventions are happening in the home and with the family. That's the main takeaway for today. And you'll see that there are a lot of ongoing intervention studies actually happening. So the 26 completed interventions here, there are 47 intervention studies still going on now. So we're seeing an increase in the type of research that's being done to try to intervene on this problem. So this is the model that I work from. We talked about Samaroff yesterday and this sort of transactional model. So this takes into account the transactional sort of piece. This is taking a look. This is coming from a model by Catherine Barnard in the nursing world. And when we take a look at what the responsibilities in the dyad are between the caregiver and the baby for helping with responsiveness, the caregivers have to be aware of the cues that the infants are showing. They have to accurately interpret those cues, and they have to then provide a developmentally appropriate response. The infant's job, to make things easier for the caregiver, right, is to be clear in the cues. How many of you have infants? Or have had infants at some point? Yeah? They don't usually come with a user manual, with, say, in a box, right? So that and there's not a glossary that tells us what all these different cues mean. So the work that I've done has been to actually start to help people understand what the hunger cues are and the fullness cues are and how they change over time. But the intervention I'm talking about today is actually one where again, we've seen these interventions have focused on the caregivers to try to help them be more responsive to cues. The intervention that I'm going to be discussing today, the study we're doing that, but it's the first one that I know of where we're actually trying to also work on the infant side of things to help them be more clear in the types of cueing that they have. What the theory is saying to us is that when there's a discordance in terms of the interaction, where caregivers are feeding when the infants are not hungry, so an infant cries, and rather than thinking through, are they bored, are they in pain, do we need a diaper change, those sorts of things, if the first instinct or the regular sort of go-to is to offer food, that it's thought that this is teaching some learning to the infants around emotion regulation with food. And then on the other end, if the parents are trying to push feeding beyond fullness, so the infants are showing that they're done, but the parent says, yeah, but there's still another ounce in the bottle. And my healthcare provider has said 3 ounces every 3 hours, then you're going to finish this, right? And so they'll chase the babies around and try to get them to feed. And it's thought that if this is happening consistently over time, that this is taking away the infant's ability to stay in tune to those internal sensations of hunger and fullness, and that the eating then will be driven by something else. Perhaps it's the time, and for us, maybe it's also true that we think, it's noon, it's time for us to have lunch, right? But do we ask ourselves, are we really hungry right now? Or is it because this is the prescribed time? Kind of interesting questions there. There's questions then about, does this lead to increased feeding? This impaired self-regulation may then be related to this accelerated weight gain and obesity risk. So my intervention is focused on trying to work on decreasing that discordant responsiveness. First off, we need to ask the question, can infants actually self-regulate? So I'm talking about typically developing infants, and I really want to make sure I drive that home, particularly for this audience. This is an old study by Sam Foman and colleagues from 1975, but it was an interesting little study. They only actually studied girls, for some reason in this study, baby girls, but they manipulated the energy density in the formula. So they had one formula that was 54 calories per 100 milliliters and another that was 100 calories. And what you can see here is that the babies actually adjusted their intake to make sure that they were taking in about the same amount of energy. Yeah. This is another study by Piercy and DeCastro. And this is something that's a takeaway message that I talk to parents about a lot, is that this was looking at variation in terms of intake of energy within a day, across days. So you see that there's a fair amount of variability in the morning, afternoon, and evening. So a child may be taking in more one morning, and then they take in a little bit less at lunch, and then they maybe take in more in the evening, and the next day they're taking in less at morning, but they're taking in more at lunch. But if we look across the day, the variation is much smaller. So we can allow infants to eat how much they will eat for the typically developing infant across the day, because across days together, we're seeing they're actually doing pretty well. We've seen a diminishment in energy self-regulation when we start getting into preschool and elementary. So they do studies where they actually will give children a certain amount of food, like a preload, essentially is what we call it, of a certain amount of energy. And then they'll let them go into another room where there's all kinds of food and things lying about after the children have said that they're already full from the first part. And then they'll go in and see, do they continue taking food? And we see that these older children are less able to manage that they've already had enough to eat from what they've told us, but then they go in and start taking more. So again, these first 2 years of life are thought to be a very critical period for learning about eating and food and self-regulation, as the infant is moving from a very dependent period to increasing autonomy with being able to choose the foods that they'll eat and how much. So behavioral self-regulation is a focus for me. And this is looking at the ways that individuals monitor and manage their emotional, social, and cognitive resources in response to internal or external stimulation. This is something that emerges over time. And it is shaped in many ways by the caregiving experience that they're having. So again, initially in infancy, you've got almost a complete reliance on caregivers, more independence with increasing age, and the ways that caregivers respond to their baby's needs may help them in terms of modulating how they're managing stress and their self-regulation as they go along. So, the study that I'm doing is we're using infant sign language as a way to help babies and their parents have a shared language that they can use before the infants can talk. So I take it from most of you, at least in the room, having been here, that you speak more than one language. Yeah? And when you were learning that second language, you probably understood more of what was being said to you than you could say. Yeah? It's the same for infants. We know that receptive language precedes expressive language. So they can understand what's being said to them before they have the capacity to say it. So before they can say milk, they can easily say milk. This is the sign for milk, right? Because they have the gross motor skills for that. So using infant sign language as a way to create a bridge between caregivers and their infants so we could get better insight into the infant state, we can teach them to say things like, instead of having to use the word hungry or eat, we see the baby here on the left, eat. The baby here on the, maybe it's, yeah, on your right, more, right? So they want more milk, yeah? More to drink, right? All done. This is easy, yeah? All done. So just teaching a handful of signs to the parents and the babies. We don't want them to feel like they have to learn all sign language. This is overwhelming. But if we can teach them 5 or 6 simple signs to help them to be able to tune in, we start when the babies are between 4 and 9 months of age, and we follow them for 6 months. So they can start signing back within a few months. We tell the parents they'll have to be patient, right? But we're looking at using sign language. We use a program called Sign with Your Baby, and we're also providing training to the families around infants' abilities to self-regulate themselves if they're typically developing. Communicating their states with intention, so how infants can actually be intentional in their behavior. There have been studies where they've looked at mothers' thoughts around, can babies tell when they're hungry or full? And they're saying, no, they don't have a lot of confidence in their babies to be able to do this. So we want to help them to recognize that their infants can be intentional, they can communicate these states, and using nonverbal means like the sign language can be a way to do that. We're also teaching caregivers about what's expected in terms of development for infants. So things like neophobia, fear of the new. So it's actually an adaptive response for children to want to reject new foods. We think from an evolutionary perspective, if a child was out crawling around during hunting and gathering and they grab a plant that's poisonous and they eat it, not so good for infant survival, right, for the human species. So we have an initial rejection for bitter foods. So we help parents to recognize that they may have to expose infants to foods 15 times or 20 times before they'll actually take it. So they can be persistent in this too. Our goal was to deliver this intervention through a national home visiting program. So in some of your countries you may already have this, but in the United States there are a few different programs. Parents as Teachers was the group that we were going to work with. It's a home visiting program where children between birth and 5 years of age, they have a professional parent educator that will come and visit them in the home and provide all kinds of different developmental education for them. They have a really nice curriculum, and so we will augment that curriculum. The parent educators would go into the home and provide this education. We've actually had to alter our plans already, unfortunately, because the Parents as Teachers group very, very interested and engaged in participating in the project, but the funding is for a 2-year study with a relatively small budget. and the number of infant pairs and mother pairs that were available to us was too low, actually, in the area. And so we kept trying to expand our geographic region, but then budget constraints said, you can't do it. So we've actually had to stop our partnership with Parents as Teachers for now, and we're doing the intervention ourselves, more locally, but we've designed it to be able to integrate directly into the curriculum for Parents as Teachers. So if we show that it's effective, this is a type of intervention that can be scaled up very, very quickly at a national level. How are we doing some of our data collection? I talked about observations before, so we actually have a coding scheme where we can see the types of behaviors that infants are showing, and we can see how caregivers are responding to those, and we can rate them then in terms of their responsiveness to hunger, to interest in feeding in the middle, and to fullness. And we're also measuring, so we're taking GoPro cameras. Have you seen the GoPro cameras? Very, very small. So they're a little cube, they're only about this big. We can take them into the home, and up to 50 cameras can be synchronized with one smart remote control. So we can have a surround and be able to capture behavior from many different angles. We hit our smart remote, all the cameras come on at the same time, all the video is synchronized then when we go to do our analysis. We also have in the center here, Actiwave Cardio. We're capturing physiology on the moms and the babies too. So we're measuring ECG. We're interested in looking at the heart rate variability because an aspect of heart rate variability called respiratory sinus arrhythmia has been associated with self-regulation in cognition and behavior. So we're interested to see how this might be related to self-regulation with energy intake. And we're taking out scales, and we're taking out our measuring boards to get our anthropometric data. The other thing that we're using, thank you Vanderbilt, is REDCap. REDCap is a research electronic data capture, and this is a very nice system for being able to collect data in the field. It's web-based and secure, and you can build all of your questionnaires and everything into, we have an iPad that we can take out into the field. And when the parents are filling out the data on the self-report questionnaires, or we're entering the data on anthropometrics, rather than having paper and pencil that we then have to go back and do the data entry for, this goes directly into a database. It's captured there. And it just facilitates us being able to do our analysis down the line. So we're very excited about what's happening with this study so far. The parents are very excited about it as well. I did a pilot study before and in one county. And what was really, really nice to hear was that the parents were getting on board with this. And sometimes the grandparents were saying, what are you doing a sign language for? This is new age, you guys. Yeah. But then they would see the babies start signing back to the parents, and the grandparents were like, oh, this is cool. And then the whole family gets involved with it. And we've already had a mom in our study telling us that her baby has started signing back to her. So very, very exciting, and look forward to sharing results with you sometime in the future. So thank you. So the question was about what's the definition for overweight or obese child? And from the World Health Organization standpoint, we look at growth curves. So we're taking a look at the length, and we're taking a look at weight. And for adults, we can calculate body mass index. For infants, we don't really calculate body mass index. We do something called weight for length, Z-scores instead, that follow along a growth curve. So if an infant is greater than or equal to 85%, so they're heavier, essentially in terms of their weight for length than 85% of other infants their age. And we actually divide this out in terms of sex as well. So there are different ratings for boys and for girls, just in terms of expectations there. Greater than or equal to 85% is overweight. greater than or equal to 95% is obese. So they're larger than 95% of boys or girls their age. Yeah.
Thank you. So we keep repeating ourselves. Christine?
And maybe I can do it first go. Oh, you never know. People are coming. Well, they probably haven't got a choice. Did you have a choice? Okay, thank you, Mats. I feel like I can't do anything with that, sorry. Let me find my presentation. Okay. So I think that, Dale, you got up and said now for something completely different. Well, that's how I feel too. Hasn't it been a rich morning, though, again? So so varied and interesting and, yeah, really, really good. But I am going to take a different tack, I think. So let's see what that is. Increasing children's engagement in therapeutic interventions was the topic I was given. So let's see what I did with it. I'm going to talk about why we would want it, and what we know about engagement in therapy, and what might the conditions be for high engagement in therapy. So that's where I'm going. So let's see. The first thing I did was I thought, okay, I need to know what we mean by an intervention. And so the dictionary says it's an act of intervening, interfering, or interceding with the intent of modifying the outcome. That actual definition is quite neutral. Could be for good or for bad. If we look a little bit further, an effort made by individuals or groups to improve the well-being of someone, or in medicine or surgery, it's defined as treating or curing a condition. And I guess we would see that both of those definitions have a positive stance. There's an expectation that we're interfering for good as opposed to bad. So that's something. So, okay, we're starting with some definitions. If I then come back to the framework, which is the situation, I guess, that we're talking about here, or I've been thinking about, I would say that the framework is neutral about the activity or setting in which participation or engagement is considered. And so then we think about life situations where, of course, we're interested in participation in all sorts of life situations. And we often think about the life situations of children as being in the home, the school, preschool, and the community. Is therapy a life situation? Perhaps. So, therapy as a life situation might be unavoidable if it's available. If you have a serious car accident, then we would like to think that if it's available, that you would have some therapeutic intervention as a result of that. But it could also be avoidable if you've given a choice. So do we choose to come or not come to therapeutic interventions that are on offer to us? So again, we have to think about some of those concepts that are related to participation around preferences and choices and so forth. But why would we want engagement? So that's really talking about attendance up before, but why would we want engagement? And so then I'm back in the dictionary again, or back on the web, I should say, really. So if I look at engagement in business, they say it's really important to be engaged in business because you have better productivity, better efficiency, better effectiveness. I mean, they talk about their employees' engagement. And if you think about school, we've been hearing very much about a better learning outcome, deeper, faster, increased academic success, better personal development. So there are good positive outcomes for engagement from a schooling perspective. If I look at the community recreation literature, it talks about engagement builds a stronger, healthier, happier, safer community. If I look at from citizenship's engagement, it says, well, increased tax revenue. Well, that's okay. Better allocation of resources and increased trust. Lots of positive, or at least things that people are desiring from an increase in engagement. And in terms of therapy, I guess our positives are increased wellness, increased well-being, increased participation, increased quality of life. So these are the positive attributes that we're interested in if we're engaging. So now if I come back to participation attendance, and we think about participation attendance as frequency or time spent, or the diversity or range of activities in which children should spend time, we can think about that as individual settings, or we could think about it as patterns of attendance in the home, the school and the community as being optimal or suboptimal over time. And we have these two questions then. How much is enough? And what is a desirable pattern? So we think about that. And then if we think about patterns of attendance in therapeutic activities, we have to ask the same questions. How much is enough? And what's a desirable pattern? So participation attendance, if I think in the literature and in practice, is often been, in therapy, has often been equated with client or family response to following regimes, to adhering to recommendations or advice, complying with instructions, doing what you're told, doing as expected. And primarily those things have been around with the goal of achieving some sort of therapeutic dose or effect. So there's sort of some adherence, but there's a very much a paternalistic, we know what's right, come and do this much kind of response. And lots of that, of course, is built on evidence, but not all of it. If we think about participation involvement, then we're back to our definition, the experience while attending of engagement, persistence, affect, perhaps social connection. And in the healthcare literature, at least, the term engagement is used much more commonly than the term involvement, although the word involvement is often used or sometimes used to define engagement. So we have this problem with the language. So if I look at Bright's work, who did a very nice systematic review of healthcare engagement, which was published in 2015, she talked about these two different attributes that Mats has mentioned a couple of times over these days. The first being engagement in, which is defined as a patient state. So that internal experience expressed by observable behaviours is how Bright defines it. And then she talks about that as being with what you are doing, participating beyond talk, participation, contribution, persistence, deliberate, intentional, effortful participation. So I'm throwing you some words around what she defines as engaging in. And she also talks about engagement with. And she talks about this as a process of connection between the client and a practitioner or a service. And the words around that are that it's relational. It can start before the service. It involves collaboration, client-centeredness, co-established priorities between a client and a service provider. But it also includes appointment keeping, compliance and collaboration with treatment. So what are the conditions of engagement then in therapy? So there are conditions for a practitioner and there are conditions for clients. So this is a long list, and some of these words you've already heard. So persistence, a caring attitude, active listening, client-centred approach, making information and activities meaningful, understanding the client's perspective, co-established priorities, an ability to create a climate of engagement, empathy and trust. Though I don't think we would argue with any of those. For the client, persistence, a positive stance to the intervention, a collaborative stance, appointment keeping, got to keep your appointments, perceived usefulness of the intervention, being open to communication, initiation of activity, so taking some responsibility and initiation, respect and appreciation, commitment, effort, willingness and trust. So another list of words that we would see as related to what happens in a good therapeutic relationship. So her proposed definition of engagement is that it's a co-constructed process and state that incorporates a process of gradually connecting with each other and or a therapeutic program, which enables the individual to become an active, committed and invested collaborator in health care. So that's the definition. Now what about in paediatrics? So in paediatrics, we think about engagement as requiring not only the child, but also the family and the caregiver in an intervention process. Both, one or neither, may actually be engaged. So we would also recognise that the quality of the engagement in a healthcare interaction is really important to the quality of the outcomes. I think we would know that for a long time. But I think it's also true that we have rarely measured it. I think some work going on here is actually tackling that, but I don't think it's so common that it's measured. So then we look at a couple of studies. So Dorigo has looked at engaging with and did a project where they were working to try and facilitate the engaging with component through the application of self-determination theory with young people with impairments. And so they worked towards supporting autonomy, and they did that through collaborative goal setting and providing opportunities for choice. They supported relatedness, and so that was really focused on the quality of that therapeutic relationship, so building rapport and a therapeutic alliance, and supporting competence, so taking time to observe changes, providing opportunity for challenge and mastery for the young people who were involved in this study. So those things, again, are things that we're familiar with in terms of self-determination theory. And then the engaging in aspect for this study was really, they defined that as a multifaceted state of affective, behavioural and cognitive commitment or investment in the therapy. And from an affective perspective, they defined that as being emotional connection, positive affect, excitement, enthusiasm, joy, interest, energy and alertness. Behaviourally, it was related to asking questions, sharing thoughts, having a positive body language and taking up the recommendations, doing the activities. And then from a cognitive perspective, it was the effort, the readiness for change, the perceived need for an intervention. So what they found then in terms, I've missed a piece, but anyway, so that was one of the things that they actually looked at in terms of what they could see was happening in these young people. And then as a part of this process of research that this group have been involved in, what they have then done is work towards building a measure. And that measure is from Gillian King's group and from Canada. And they have conceptualised using some of this earlier work that I've just walked you through as that process of optimal client state in a therapeutic relationship. And so you can see these elements coming back into this framework that they have to develop a measure of engagement in therapy. So the components of engagement are affective, cognitive and behavioural, as I've defined. And the client change process is seen to be related to their receptiveness of the clients, their willingness and their self-efficacy. And the optimal client state is a hopeful stance, conviction and confidence. So these are sort of setting the scene, if you like, for a high level of engagement in a therapeutic encounter. So as a result of the work, this preliminary work that they have done, they have now built this paediatric rehabilitation intervention measure of engagement observation called PRIMO, much easier to say PRIMO than all that other stuff. It's now available online. So the items in the PRIMO are client items which rate the extent of the client's interest and enthusiasm, the client's use of strengths-based language, their openness to what is being said and done, their overall comfort and confidence in engaging with the service provider. The practitioner items are in this measure as well, and it's the extent of the practitioner's interest and enthusiasm, their use of strengths-based language, their comfort and confidence in engaging with the client, and their listening and communication behaviours. And there are also items that are about the interaction between the client and the provider, and it's the extent of overall warmth of the interaction and the collaborative nature of that interaction. And I would just point out that the extent of rating scale is not a measure of time spent. Okay? So it's an extent of, a lot, a little. So in this other study, which I think I was just about to go into previously, this study by SMART, which is actually starting to use these strategies to support engagement, what they were able to see was that with these focus on these aspects, that they could see effective strategies being able to be recognised and used and understood by the young people in this study. And so they were able to see that from an affective perspective, the young people could build a relationship based on familiarity and reciprocity of the relationship within the therapy situation. And those were able to guide the program using the youth's preferences and strengths. So the program was able to be responsive to the youth within it. In terms of the cognitive strategies, they were able to assist the youth to envisage meaningful change, and that was important. so that they could see where they were going. They could use youth's learning styles and be responsive to youth's learning styles and promote their awareness of their progress. And that seemed to be quite important, not to forget to kind of look back and see where you have come from. In terms of behavioural strategies, they were able to ensure that the youth had access to resources, that they had multiple opportunities to make decisions, and that they could provide opportunities for the youth to showcase their capabilities. So that evidence, again, of what was happening with them. So those strategies to support engagement were reflected in these semi-structured interviews with these young people. Blank slide, because I just need to slightly change track. And I want you to think for a minute, okay? So we have to hold some of that background knowledge now and have a think about your own situations. Because my next question is, does the intervention focus matter when we are thinking about engagement in therapeutic situations? So now, it's for you. If we're thinking about in paediatric therapy, we're thinking about interventions focused at a body structure and function. Then we're thinking about interventions that target the physiological, anatomical and psychological domains of the person. Where does engagement sit? How do you think about it? If we think about activity-based interventions, the sort of use it or lose it, learn what you practice, focused on repetition and motor learning and learning theories, engagement. How does it sit? Where does it sit in the therapeutic approach and process? Environmental or contextual interventions, individualised goal setting, just right challenges, getting a good person environment fit, thinking about engagement. Participation based, so the person situated in real life contexts, transaction focused to ensure facilitated experiences, resiliency and socialisation focused outcomes. Where does engagement sit? So if we think back, I talked very briefly about this transactional framework for rehabilitation yesterday. Now I'll bring it back to the fore again today. So this transactional framework for rehabilitation, so I'm thinking at not at the body structures and functions so much, but more at the activity participation end of things. So there's a focus, I think, on the shift in rehabilitation, research and practice to, I've got those inverted commas, real world contexts outside the clinic, where participation and environment are much more in focus than body structure and function, and even activity. So if we do that, it requires us to have a much deeper and broader awareness of the lives of children and their families, and of those transactional processes of change that occur across the life course. So we have to have a different perspective. It's not, I think often in therapy, and certainly I can think in my past, is very much focused on looking at the child in the here and now in this situation and what they can do. And I think we get a very foreshortened view of what happens. It's a very short perspective, and we need a much longer one. We need a life course perspective. So why should we change? We should change because living with lifelong impairment requires multiple ongoing adjustments and adaptations across the lifespan, as contexts, activities, processes and people change. And we can be focused on socialising children and families to our rehabilitation and our therapy rather than to their situations and their contexts. So that can happen. So engagement in therapy, then I would say it should be given very special consideration in our therapeutic interactions, because I think it will shape how the child and the family and the practitioner experience the intervention. And if we think about our framework and we think about where engagement sits within that, that actually how we do things will contribute to the differential effects of interventions. So if we provide the same intervention with the same children in a different context, we may have a different outcome. If we provide the same intervention to different children in the same context, we may have a different outcome. And if we provide those things at different developmental stages, we may have a different outcome. And how we engage in those processes and look at that transactional process within that will be really important to those outcomes. So, if therapy is situated in real life contexts, then engagement will be in other life situations, not in therapy. Therapy will be about seeking those opportunity structures and the experiences that support participation, attendance and involvement, and they'll be focused on naturally occurring transactions and supporting in-context experiences and capacity development in situ. Practitioner roles will be as advocates, knowledge brokers, collaborators, facilitators, educators, coaches. Not experts doing too. If therapy is a special life situation, then maximising outcomes in the minimum time period might be an imperative. If involvement is defined as engagement, persistence, affect, and perhaps social connection, then I think current literature suggests that engagement can be supported as both a process and a state, and that the state of engagement includes persistence and affect, which can be further described as effective cognitive and behavioural engagement, and that social connection is a critical component of the therapeutic relationship. Thank you.
Well, I think we have to thank Christine for this. It was... I'm overwhelmed. Super good. Okay. Lunchtime, and for those of you who haven't signed up to that for the afternoon,